change resistance transition, how people move through the change process from initial surprise through compliance into commitment. This is going to be the focus here. There are different change models, and the topic of change models oftentimes is very confusing because authors and many speakers do not differentiate the different purposes of the different models. And I'm going to take a little time now here to explain where the models of resistance transition takes place within the broader framework so that you can see where this fits within your other aspects of organizational change. The focus then is going to be on the resistance transitions itself, and we're going to be talking about 4 specific transition models. But these models really are subordinate to how individuals change. The stages of change that people go through individually creates instances of resistance so that you have a broader perspective of individual change with a subordinate or embedded resistance models. But the individual model of change also fits within a higher category still of the project methodology, how the project is initiated and managed through the implementation. And there's a 4th area of diagnostic models, those that are used to analyze and prescribe change itself. So within the broader perspective then, there's 4 different types of change models, and in this lecture we're going to focus just on those that relate to resistance transition. Think of them as being linked models, each with a different purpose. The purpose in this case, understanding resistance to change. First, the loss cycle. This comes from the grief or the death, in that there's the death of what is familiar and known. This then gets into a series of steps. The shock, it's all of a sudden a surprise. The denial, it's not happening to me, it'll go away. The anger, why me? Bargaining, I promise to do this if this will be changed in some way. The depression, in that what's the use? It's too much for me. These are all different stages of grief that people go through, not only in dealing with death of someone they know, but death of the familiar within the organization. Finally, there is a tipping point. There's acceptance. It has happened. Well, okay. And then finally, taking ownership or the adaptation of your behaviors and your thought processes so that you go through a cycle of transitions that is normal and to be expected. This is the stages of loss or grief model. A second model is the psychological transition, in that performance changes over time, in which case when you initiate the change, there will be a performance dip and then improvement. The performance dip is doing something different, something you may not be prepared to do, and then once you become competent, it becomes an upward slope to higher levels of performance. You have transitions then through the process of over time becoming more competent, while first becoming what may appear to be less competent because you're doing something different. So there's a resistance initially, followed by letting go with the tipping point, and then building competency going forward to higher levels of performance. The psychological transition model. The third model is a stage of transition model similar to the grief cycle, where you lose focus, you minimize the impact, and then you go into the pit of despair. Eventually, you let go as a tipping point. You let go of the past and you're moving forward once again. but you're testing the limits, you're searching for meaning, and eventually you integrate the new ways of doing things with your old and you become more competent. So there are stages here similar to grief, but a little bit different in that you're focusing on what you're doing versus how you're reacting to the change. The fourth model is a phase of acceptance. If you ignore it, it won't happen. Eventually, though, you feel the pain and it's worse than you thought. You'll isolate yourself, you'll whine, you'll try to manipulate the system, you may become angry and aggressive toward others, you become territorial. We talked about some of these demonstrated symptoms in an earlier video. So first of all, you'll ignore it, then you'll feel the pain and it is bad. Eventually, though, you get to a tipping point and healing starts to occur. You start to look once again to the future. You'll focus on the me and the plan and how it starts to fit together, even though it is still evolving. And you'll start to look for opportunities, eventually turning the corner, fully committed, on board. But sometimes compliance is enough. And we're talking here about compliance of doing it, not necessarily wanting to do it, but agreeing to do it. So we've talked then about a loss cycle, a performance cycle, a acceptance cycle. The key then is which model should you use? What is your model of choice? It depends. All models have some validity because they come at it from different points of view. My recommendation is just choose one. Choose one based upon your comfort with understanding how people react and does it fit. It's really not critical that you use one model or another, but what is critical is that you understand that people go through phases and you may pick one model dependent upon the situation to help them move through the phases. This is different than the models of how people progress through organizational change itself, because there are 5 very specific steps that you go through, and you go from one to the next, to the third, to the fourth, to the fifth, and they're sequential in their approach. In this case, the rationale behind the model is a little bit different, and you may want to review the models later when you're in a change situation to see which one fits where people are, because that then will give you some understanding of what you may need to do different to move them forward to the next step. So what's important then is to move past the resistance toward compliance, ideally toward commitment, using the model that makes sense to move people forward. Keep the people moving forward through the resistance, though, requires some understanding of how the resistance is demonstrated. We talked about that previously. But we also need to now address the reasons, the underlying core reasons that, once addressed, will give a better focus on how to mitigate. We're moving now from the understanding into the mitigation of change resistance, dealing with the pain as it arises or mitigating the reasons in advance. That requires some understanding moving into action. The deeper understanding, though, is why people are resisting, beyond the symptoms that we see, to their core needs. Understanding the core needs, then, is the foundation for the actions in dealing with resistance. When should resistance be resisted? What do we need to be doing different?